So this church in Sacramento kept talking about me because I actually went out to Sacramento and took a group of clergy through a racial righteousness and reconciliation training over the course of 4 days and taught them what it looked like to do life together and to pursue the mosaic nature of the kingdom of God. And that is the work that I do. I'm a pastor to pastors to help pastors to understand the correlation between race, faith, and discipleship. And as we unpack this question of incarceration, this is going to feel more like a TED Talk real quick. And we're going to jump in and out. But this is a critically important issue. As we've consistently talked about racial injustice in our nation, we have not talked about incarceration yet. And so I want to highlight the issue for us. So can we go to the next slide? And then the next slide. And so I think it's critically important for me as someone emerging in this field of scholarship to acknowledge that my work comes on the heels of Michelle Alexander's work and Brian Stevenson's work, and another work that is lesser known by the name of, it's called Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. And those three books really curate the foundation of what I do. I build on that and I expand the conversation. But Michelle Alexander defines mass incarceration as a massive system of racial and social control. It is the process by which people are swept into the criminal justice system, branded criminals and felons, locked up for longer periods of time than the most other countries in the world who incarcerate people who have been convicted of crimes, and then released into a permanent second-class status in which they are stripped of basic civil and human rights, like the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, and the right to be free of legal discrimination in employment, housing, and access to public benefits. The only thing that I would add to this definition of mass incarceration has evolved into a lucrative industry where incarcerated people are financially exploited for their work. And we have to understand the way in which this system is predicated upon exploiting the least of these. And so we're going to dig into this a little bit. So next slide. So this is a picture of the truncated history that we usually get in our nation's history books. There was slavery, then there was a period all the way up until really civil rights, things were okay. And then because things weren't quite okay, Dr. King comes, and the civil rights movement moves us far ahead. They weren't fully fixed because we have the Black Power movement, but then Obama was elected and solved all our racial ills. The reality is that US history in our nation teaches us the history of middle to upper class white men, and it calls it US history. But it does not acknowledge the contributions of people of color or women. And until we have a more holistic narrative of history, people are going to continue to live into this falsified reality. So I want to set the stage for a more authentic conversation today. And I really want to fill in the yellow section of time, that 89 years that we oftentimes know nothing about, and actually help us to understand what Michelle Alexander is getting at when she talks about mass incarceration as a system of racial and social control, particularly the social control part. One of the ways my book differs from Michelle's is that Michelle really starts the conversation about mass incarceration in the 1970s with the war on drugs. I actually argue that that's an inadequate place to start if we're going to talk about the mass incarceration of particular bodies, particularly black bodies. The mass incarceration of black bodies literally starts with the abolition of slavery. And you have a brief period of empowerment for Reconstruction where it didn't happen as much, but as soon as Reconstruction is ended, federal troops are taken out of the South, there's a mad scramble to reestablish white supremacy throughout the land. That scramble manifests itself in three unholy ways that I call the unholy trinity of white supremacy's reemergence throughout the South. You have sharecropping, which most of us know. We have a collection of legislations that are literally derived from slave codes, which were laws that were applied only to slaves, but are reinscribed after abolition as black codes, which are laws that are applied throughout the South, in every state throughout the South, that explicitly apply to black people, that make it criminal to do something as trivial as walk too close to a wooden picket fence. You also have another legislation called a vagrancy law that literally says that if an African American cannot prove that they are employed, they can be incarcerated. And so with that legislation and the loophole that exists in the 13th Amendment, which says that slavery is illegal except as a punishment for a crime, you ultimately get the third manifestation, which is the convict leasing system. And with convict leasing, what you literally have is people who are arrested for being black, to be blunt, and then they are leased out to corporations and plantation owners, literally doing the exact same work that they did as slaves for the exact same no pay. And so when you understand that legacy, then it helps us to understand kind of this notion of social control. But the very last piece of the social control is right after Reconstruction, you get the emergence of the Klan. And particularly, you get the emergence of white domestic terrorism in the form of lynching. And I use that language intentionally because usually in this country, we only like to use the word terrorism when we talk about violence enacted from outside this nation by people of color. But we need to have an authentic conversation about the legacy and history of white domestic terrorism within our nation's borders. So as we consider this conversation, I want to connect it to another conversation that we usually associate based off pigmentation, and that's lawlessness. When we talk about lawlessness in our nation, we usually think about black and brown people, native people sometimes. But we don't think about white people, and particularly white elected officials. And I want us to have an honest conversation about the history of lawlessness in our nation. So let's flip to the next slide. So this is a quote from the governor of Mississippi in 1907. He says, "If it is necessary, every Negro in the state will be lynched. It will be done to maintain white supremacy." When you have an elected official emboldened to proclaim this kind of toxicity, it literally opens up the floodgates for white vigilante violence. And when we're about to go into, you'll see why this is pertinent to this conversation of racial and social control. And so this is in 1907, and I want to bracket that quote because somebody might be like, well, that's just right after slavery. That's, people were a little backwards back then. We've progressed. So let's go to the next quote. This next quote is from 1958, from Bull Connor, the Public Safety Commissioner, ironically. And he says, "Damn the law, down here we make our own law." In this, we know Bull Connor did not stand in isolation. He was connected to the governor, George Wallace, who was standing in the steps of the school, refusing a federal mandate to integrate the schools, saying segregation now, segregation today, segregation forever. And so we see this history and this legacy of white lawlessness from white elected officials. And we're about to see how this opens up the floodgates for this legacy of white domestic terrorism. So next slide. This slide actually accounts for the number of African Americans in our nation who were lynched between 1877 and 1950. But this record is only in southern states, and I think that's important. But just in these states alone, almost 4,000 African Americans were lynched over this period of time. When we talk about lynching, we usually think about it as something that, if we talk about lynching, which we really don't, but if we do, we talk about it as something that happened every now and then in extreme examples, and it was something that most of us had no connection to. Most people during this time had no connection to. I think it's critically important to understand and sit with the weight of these numbers. The next slide will actually show, this is a picture of what is known as a spectacle lynching. Most people think about lynching, they also think about, some backwards Klansmen who gathered African American in the middle of the night, executed them extrajudicially, and we just think it was something that most people didn't know about. And I talk about this because I think it's really ironic that we are in Lynchburg and we've been talking about racial injustice this whole weekend, and we have not discussed lynching. And that is not to condemn Lynchburg, but it is to say, as a black person, when I hear the name Lynchburg, my mind goes directly to this. And we have to understand the connection between the history of racialized oppression in our nation and the names that we brand things. And so in this picture of a spectacle lynching, I think it's critically important to know that historians actually talk about spectacle lynchings, and they say they function socially the same way that football games do today. So they say literally there will be huge crowds who invited their whole entire family members to come, and they would come and watch this black person be executed, and there would be a photographer who was hired to photograph the dead body as if it was a game bird. That photograph would then be mass reproduced and turned into postcards, and those postcards would be mailed out to other family members inviting them to future lynchings. In this case, we know that the largest spectacle lynching in our nation had 20,000 people who were present at it. And I want you to see the picture just to see the weight of this. And I think the most damning part of this conversation for Christians is that spectacle lynchings most often took place on Sunday afternoon after church, and they were well attended by white Christians who went to worship God on Sunday morning and saw no contradiction to what they were doing in the afternoon. And again, I don't want us to mistake this as something that's so archaic, because the reality is we know what happened just up the road in Charlottesville, and we also know that there were many people who were present there who went to church on Sunday morning. We have to have an authentic conversation about this. When we go to the next slide, lynching is not some archaic reality, and this is part of the reason why I love to talk about it, because when you talk about slavery, people say, oh, that was so far ago, what does that have to do with anything? First, that's an inadequate response, but I like to talk about lynching because Tuskegee University actually studied lynchings once they became so prevalent, and it was not until 1952 that they could record a year where an African American was not lynched in this nation. 1952. Many of you were alive in 1952. If you weren't, your parents were. And so we have to understand and grapple with this legacy if we're really going to have an authentic conversation about race in our nation. From 1881 to 1952, we know that at least 5,500 African Americans were lynched. So this helps us to understand what Michelle Alexander is talking about with racial and social control. Now let's go specifically to who is incarcerated. This is a critical question, so let's go to the next slide. One of the things, this is a very truncated illustration of my presentation, but women since 1980 have actually grown as far as prison population at a rate that's 50% higher than men in our nation. Women are currently the fastest growing populace within our nation's prisons, jails, and detention centers, but we usually only talk about mass incarceration from a male perspective. So I think that's critically important, especially when we understand this slide. 2 years ago, USA Today actually did a study on children with incarcerated parents, and they found that 1 in 14 kids in our nation have at least one incarcerated parent. And that number is exacerbated by race and poverty. So 1 in 8 poor children have at least one incarcerated parent. Let's go to the next slide. This is an illustration of the astronomical growth, unprecedented growth in our nation's prisons, jails, and detention centers since the war on drugs was launched in 1971. So this is why Brian Stevenson and Michelle Alexander start this conversation here. So I want you to see that, but I want you to guesstimate where 1980 would be. And that's a critical year because there's something that happens where you start to see the numbers just go off the chart. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. This next slide actually talks about the racial disparities. And the numbers are exacerbated from this point. This is a chart from 2010, but I use this because, quite honestly, Christians don't really like to talk about race. And so they like to say, well, you can fudge the numbers. So I use the census because we all trust the census. So in 2 years, I'll have an updated chart. But this is the census data from 2010. But right now, in our nation, it is predicted that 1 in 3 black men will spend time behind bars in their lifetime. The number is 1 in 6 for Hispanic males. How this breaks down is that African American men represent 6.5% of our nation's population, but 40.2% of our nation's incarcerated population. Another pipeline, I talk about 5 pipelines that are really funneling people into mass incarceration. There's the war on drugs, there's the school to prison pipeline, there's the deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities, which is the thing we never talk about. And then there is the privatization of prisons, how prisons have become so lucrative. And then lastly, I make the argument that there has been a parallel war to the war on drugs that has been launched on immigrants, but we don't call it a war on immigration. And we should. So this next slide actually shows that we live in a nation right now where there's 44 states plus the District of Columbia who have more people with severely diagnosed mental health impairments who are incarcerated in the state's largest facility than are receiving treatment in the state's largest facility. This problem is so bad that 4 years ago, medical professionals in the field bluntly said prisons are the new asylums. We are warehousing people with mental health impairments to the point that 90,000 people every year are literally judicially designated as incompetent to stand trial, which means literally they cannot mentally comprehend why they are being incarcerated, but yet we still incarcerate them. This next slide is something that I told you to keep your eye on 1980. In 1980, we started to be able to see that we were literally running out of space within our nation's federal jails and prisons and detention centers. There were literally no other place to put all the people we're incarcerating. We saw this coming ahead of time. So we had a critical question to ask ourselves at that moment. Were we gonna embrace diversion programs? Were we gonna start to actually send people who were coming into incarceration because of chemical addictions and get them the medical interventions they needed? Or were we also going to look at resentencing, look at mandatory minimums, question if they were effective, look at the disparities in sentencing between things like crack and powder cocaine? Were we going to take seriously some of the ways in which we know that incarceration was not actually breeding transformation and rehabilitation? Or were we gonna do what we did? Hire a third party to ultimately to build new private prisons and jails and detention centers so we can continue to incarcerate people at the same rate that we had been. So the state of California is a perfect example. Since 1980, California has built 22 new prisons and 1 new degree granting institution. How this plays out in our nation, right now in our nation, we have more jails, detention centers, and prisons than we do degree granting institutions. Because of that reality, there are more people in many parts of the country who are living behind bars than are living on college campuses. This next slide actually legitimates what I talk about with the war on immigration. Since 1998 to 2011, there has been a 145% increase in the rate of people who are incarcerated for immigration offenses. And I think this chart is critically important because what drives the war on drugs, what drives law and order rhetoric is this fear of those violent criminals, those super predators who are out to destroy our kids. But when you actually look at the chart, there are 2 offenses that are driving mass incarceration today, both of which are nonviolent. Drug offenses, immigration offenses. We need to hold our politicians to a more authentic conversation about what's going on and what's transpiring. Another critical problem with our system, let's go to the next slide, is that 1 in 25 people who are sentenced to the death penalty are actually innocent. In light of knowing that, we continue to embrace the death penalty as this archaic manifestation of justice. And one would think, in particular, that Christians would really understand how problematic this is, given that our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, was falsely incarcerated and falsely put to death by the state. Next slide. But unfortunately, that is not the reality. This is an indictment on our discipleship. When you look at the levels of support from Christians for the death penalty, it is important to note that there is no coincidence that there is a disproportionate number of Black and brown people who do not see capital punishment as an adequate form of justice. But there is overwhelming support that comes from white evangelical Protestants. Communities who are most targeted by mass incarceration see the flaw in criminal justice, saying that the death penalty is an adequate form of justice. But the community that's least targeted by it is more supportive. So what does this have to do with our faith? As I come to a close, I think the church has failed to take seriously the biblical passages that call us into communion with our incarcerated brothers and sisters. Matthew 25 is explicitly clear that Christians have an ethical, moral, and theological responsibility to be present with our brothers and sisters behind bars. Jesus is so passionate about this that he says, when you actually do this, you don't do it just to the least of these, you do it to me. So I give this presentation and I say, the only reason why I have to give this presentation is because we don't know, because we don't go. If we were present behind bars, we would know these realities. We would know how the image of God is being defaced from people on a daily basis. We would know that 90,000 people in our nation are subjected to solitary confinement on a daily basis, where they're locked in a 12 by 7-inch cell, where they are literally locked in darkness for 23 of the 24 hours of the day, given access to human contact and to sunlight for 1 hour a day. Neurological specialists say that this is a dehumanizing process that literally has irreversible impact on people. But the other thing is, what does it mean for us to take seriously passages like Hebrews 13:3 that tell us that we're supposed to remember the incarcerated as if we ourselves were incarcerated? What would our faith look like if we took that passage seriously? The other thing is, let's go to the next slide. Most people don't really grapple with the fact that 4 of the books of our Bible were written in the midst of incarceration. The 4 Pauline epistles. And literally the book of Colossians, we see Paul, who is incarcerated, who is pastoring the church in Colossae back to faithfulness because they're backsliding. And so you have an incarcerated person who's actually teaching the church how to faithfully follow Jesus Christ. And we only have that book because one of Paul's disciples was faithfully visiting him in prison, like Matthew 25 tells us to. And one of those letters that he took back to the city was actually the book of Colossians. But even more than that, the church must grapple with the fact that literally if you take away all of the criminals away from the Bible, there is no gospel. There is no good news without criminals. Literally. Let's go to the next slide. John the Baptist, Paul, who wrote the majority of the New Testament, Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, Samson, Hananiah the seer, Joseph, Malachi, Stephen, Jeremiah, Peter, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Silas. There is no good news without criminals. That's not even to mention the people in the Bible who committed criminal activities who should have been incarcerated. Moses, who murdered somebody, David, who murdered somebody. Imagine the holes in our text if we were to take away incarcerated people. But there was something so distinctive about the early church that they understood that God could still work through people who were incarcerated. That the good news had the power to transform lives and to actually emanate from behind prison walls. The church today has lost that kind of imagination, and we are just as prone to stigmatize and dehumanize returning citizens as anybody else. And I know what you're thinking. Well, these people went to jail for bearing witness to the gospel. Well, let's have that conversation. Today, the church is just as likely to actually throw stones at the for people who actually get incarcerated for bearing witness to the gospel in prophetic ways as anybody else. When my brother Shane gets locked up for protesting the death penalty, there are Christians who are throwing stones at my brother. They don't understand that form of discipleship, that radical form of discipleship that calls us to prophetically bear witness in public spaces. And in that way, we have lost our ability to live into what the early church knew. And I'll close with this. The book of Acts actually is the book that we actually point to when we talk about the church in its healthiest expression. But what we don't talk about is the book of Acts has more accounts of Christians being incarcerated for their prophetic witness than any other book in the rest of the Bible. If we were to take seriously our moral and ethical responsibility to bear witness in public ways that are disruptive to worldly empires, that bear witness in civil disobedience to those allegiances that the world is trying to entice us to subscribe to and pledge our allegiance to, and actually bear witness to the gospel in prophetic ways that bear witness to where our true citizenship was, the church could actually be the prophetic presence in the world that it was called to be. We could be the leaven in the loaf. And if our criminal justice system is ever going to shift from a system that's predicated upon dehumanization, isolation, and financial exploitation, the church has to be the leading advocate for a justice system that's going to be restorative. We have to advocate for reconciliation, healthy reintegration, and transformation.